Turn this up in our headphones, Charles.
Woo! Turning it up! Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friends, Charles.
Ah, yes, we use the plural yet again. We have another friend on the show today. We are honored to be joined by a fantasy blogger extraordinaire, Peter The Swordsmith. Peter, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being on today.
It's amazing to be on here with you both, and you're going to make me blush if you you refer to me as an extraordinaire again. And it really is. It's an honor to be with you here both.
The honor's all ours, Peter. Peter the Swordsmith is the moniker that he goes by on his blog. He reviews all kinds of novels in the fantasy genre. I caught his review of The Poppy War most recently, and I'm sure we could have a whole hour-long discussion about that. But instead of that, we are here talking the Riyria Revelations. But before we get too far into it, Peter, would you like to take a moment just to introduce yourself, explain a little bit more about what you do and where people can find you?
Sure. I think, most people will know me on Twitter by my moniker of at Eldrazi56. It goes back to my love of the Magic the Gathering card game. And for those who follow my blogging work, find me on the Swordsmith blog, which, along with my assistant editor, Vesna, we review sometimes some very exciting, very interesting, but cool sci-fi and fantasy books.
Yes. All right, guys, highly recommend checking it out. And when we've had a couple back and forths on the Twitter sphere now, and we had discovered this. We were talking about some of our favorite fantasy series of all time, and one of the series that we both had this mutual fascination with, and that's Dylan, me, and Peter. We all kind of were able to relate to the Riyria Revelations by Michael J Sullivan. So we thought, let's take this conversation to the show and let's go ahead and have this discussion. And we decided to make it a spoiler-free discussion so that we can recommend it to people and bring in people who maybe have heard of the series but haven't given it a try yet. So what we're going to do here is just kind of gush about the Riyria Revelations, talk about why we love it so much. And yeah, it's super exciting. And I don't think there is any other place to start except talking about our main cast here of Royce and Adrian. This is a duo that in the fantasy community gets brought up time and time again of like the best example of a buddy duo in fantasy, the best friendship in fantasy. And it's on the short list for myself as well. Peter, if you could describe, I had read your post on this when you talked about your favorite series. What makes Royce and Adrian just jump off the page and makes it everyone's go-to for best fantasy duo?
Why? Well, when you first read the book, that Royce and Hadrian are in a situation, and it's summed up for me in the opening pages when Hadrian turns to Royce and simply says, "Sorry," to him.
Oh.
And the situation kind of escalates from there. But the wonderful thing about them is how they rely on each other and how they know each one's sort of strengths and weaknesses and what they can do well and certainly what they can't do, which is so important for the stories.
I agree completely. It's one of those things where a lot of times the best, like when you just listen to two people that have been friends for so long and you just listen to them banter back and forth, you really get the sense like you're become almost like a part of it. You've become implicit to their bantering, their jokes to each other, and even just the implication of, oh, I'm sorry. It's like, oh, this has happened before. They're kind of in this together, and it's one of those things that it makes it so full of charm.
Yeah.
Yep.
It is charming. It's wonderful. And one of the things I have found is when I return to this series is I almost greet Royce and Hadrian like old friends.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's something you see spoken of quite a lot about them. And I think for fantasy characters, that's something that's easily ranks them up as one of my sort of within my top 5 fantasy characters. Certainly character duos.
Oh yeah, duos for sure. I think that's a very common sentiment across a lot of our Twitter sphere that we have seen. I don't think it's any spoiler to say what's on the back of the book. You have Royce Melbourne, who's a skilled thief, and you have Adrian Blackwater, who is a mercenary, and they're best friends basically, and they make a living together carrying out different assignments, jobs, tasks, and then this story kicks off when they're hired for a very specific task of stealing a famous sword, and then that kind of throws them in the middle of this whole conspiracy plots. They just get thrown into the middle of it, and I think that's another thing that makes this friendship so charming as well. They've known each other for so long, and as they get deeper and deeper into these conspiracies and they become more and more important in the world around them, it's just kind of funny to watch them gain that notoriety while they also are always these kind of friends that are bantering and getting into hijinks and they know each other's faults and things like that. So to see them thrust into this is such it builds their character. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I just love these duos that have those. It's like they have a ton of differences, but underlying it is that level of just trust, where it's like, look, I have trouble understanding you and why you are the way that you are, but I just know that underneath it all is that deep sense of care for me, and whatever you're doing, I'm going to trust you because you have things that I don't, and you can see things that I am unable to see. And it's like, those are such amazing friendships, and it's depicted through Hadrian and Royce so well. And I freaking love roguish characters. So Royce is a character that I just have gravitated toward so much. I mean, and this is one, let's be real. I read this one years and years ago, way before the podcast. And it was one that I was like thinking about, who do I banter with? Like, probably not at the level of Royce and Hadrian, but I was like, this kind of reminds me of me and Charles. So I texted Charles like right after, and I was like, dude, you gotta check this book out. And he did, because
yes, I read it on your recommendation. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it was so it was so fun and so awesome, Peter, to be bringing you into the fold here and get to be friends talking fantasy with each other. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, it is. And I actually, as you mentioned that, I actually got that kind of vibe between you and Charles.
Peter.
You get that kind of thing, and it's wonderful. I think that's it is such a tick in the box for Michael J Sullivan for how well he writes characters, but specifically these ones. Royce and Hadrian endear towards you.
Agreed.
And it's just something about the way they've been sort of together for so long, as you work your way through, and then you wonder about what they've been up to for all that time.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it's a great sign of a duo in a novel when you feel like you're being brought in to their relationship, and you feel like you're getting a peek into their history and their chemistry and their inside jokes and their banter. And when it feels like you're part of it and you're laughing with them or laughing at their situations like this, and they're when they're laughing at their situation, like if they're stuck in a prison together, they're like, oh, here we are again, and you're like, oh, these guys. It's got this element to it that you really feel like you're part of their experience, and I think that's why so many people get such a kick out of reading these novels, is to watch them go through that. But Royce and Adrian are not the only two people in the Riyria Revelations, guys. There's so many more characters out there in this book. And Peter, one of the things we talked about literally right before turning on these mics was this idea of, everyone says, oh, Riyria Revelations, great fantasy duo in Royce and Adrian. But something that we wanted to make sure we talked about on this episode was all of the fantastic secondary characters that have found their ways onto these pages. And Peter, I was wondering if there was a few that stuck out to you, or maybe what makes these secondary characters in a book that so strongly has main characters in Royce and Adrian shine out.
So the first character that always comes to mind with the Riyria Revelations it's got to be Arista. She is an example of first of all, a very well drawn character who it almost feels like she kind of goes her own way. It's like Michael wrote this character and she kind of goes off on her own hand, and it's wonderful in certain scenes and what you discover about her. And something I love about Arista is just her determination. She's so determined to succeed.
Yes.
Oh, that's yes.
Yes. I always love the proactive and the relentless and the characters that show initiative. So I definitely gravitated toward her for those same reasons, Peter. She's a fantastic character, and she has such an amazing journey throughout. So this is a pretty long series. It's got those books that got mushed together into, you know what I'm talking about? There's the first two books got mushed together. It's like the Crown Conspiracy and Avampartha, if I'm I don't know if I'm saying that right. Yeah. Got mushed together into Theft of Swords and so on for the next two books.
Right. It was released as a trilogy, but each book has two books in it, so it's 6 books in total, just released in a trilogy format.
Yeah. And such a journey we go on with all of these characters. And she has, I think, one of the most interesting and most, I guess, change-inducing journeys. And that comes, I think, from Peter, that determination that you're talking about.
Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, of course. But again, I just admire her, and she has a wonderful arc as a character across all 3 books or 6 books, depending on how you look at it. She has a wonderful arc.
Definitely. And I also appreciate it, when you have such a charismatic, duo in Royce and Adrian. It's always nice to have a character that can stick out so much on their own and have their own energy separate from what they're getting themselves into. Royce and Adrian are getting themselves into, and it just adds to this world. And we have we have a whole trilogy here, 6 books, and the amount of story that we get beyond just Royce and Adrian and their shenanigans is really rich in this world. So all these secondary characters play such an important part. And the story itself, also something that we wanted to talk about, is, as we mentioned at the beginning, the kind of Royce and Adrian take a job that gets them thrust into all of these shenanigans and conspiracies. And you can't have a good conspiracy without plot twists and turns along the way. And that's something that I think gets a little bit, I think Royce and Adrian kind of shadow what all the other amazing things in this book, including all of these amazing plot developments, plot twists in this story. It's it really adds a lot to this trilogy, and really what helps it propel into such a well loved, often recommended series.
Yeah. Again, with plot twists, again, not sort of dropping anywhere near spoiler territory, but
Right.
there is. This is one of the things I admire Michael for, is the way he writes the books. But there is a very immediate plot twist in the sort of the opening sort of like 50 sort of 100 pages of Theft of Swords, which it kind of throws the story into a complete conundrum. And as you've been alluding to, Charles, it's about that sort of conspiracy and that sort of the wider issues facing the world of Ilan. And it is it's the plot twists that you encounter in this series, they're almost joyful to read. It's like, oh my god, no, what has just happened? And then you realize that it's not always a good thing. It's not always a good thing, but it's just wonderful. It's such a smooth kind of experience you're in the books.
I agree so much, Peter, and that joyful is such a great word for it. And I think it's like, I just remember these moments, and I guess it reminds me of the experience of reading Brandon Sanderson books too, where it's like you see all of these pieces that you were like that seem disparate, and then all of a sudden you reach this point where Michael ties it all together at once. And you're like, I'm overloaded with how like satisfied and joyful, and how it's like, oh my God, all of this at once. How did you these all seem like separate strings. How'd you tie them all together? And joyful is a great way to describe it, Peter. I remember so many of those moments.
Yeah, no, joyful is excellent. And comparing them to Sanderson also is interesting as well, because something that I think of when I see all of these twists and turns and these Sanderson-esque stories, I also am reminded of there's this idea of the reader experience, and authors like Sanderson and authors like Michael Sullivan, it's like, hey, the reading experience this should be fun. They should have these revelations, these moments where you're like, whoa, oh my goodness, this is amazing how this has come together. This moment of okay, I'm going to leave clues for them and then tie together at the end. It's like, it's one of those things that as an author, when you go through that, it makes the reading experience just so enjoyable and so much fun, and you're like, oh, there's payoff at the end. It's like not every author sets out to do that, but Michael Sullivan and Sanderson, within the two, and where they overlap is that they often deliver on this hey, there's gonna be these aha moments and these joyful moments and these intrigue moments that really will make all of these clues you're reading along the way, all these little bits and pieces you're leading on the way, pay off in a big way for you as the reader. And I just love when books do that. It's not easy to do, and it's just so, as you said, joyful when all the pieces click together and you didn't realize it, and all of a sudden it comes together in a major way. It's an experience that as a reader you're always chasing, I think. So that alone is just highly recommended.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things that makes the books so satisfying to read as well. And I'm not sure who did it first, but I certainly read Michael J Sullivan before I majorly read Brandon Sanderson.
Oh, interesting.
So again, that satisfaction of a story, a well put together story, clicking together very, very slowly. Well, not always slowly, sometimes very quickly, but then very slowly. And I've got a special term for it when we talk about it later. But again, it's so satisfying just when it all kind of comes together and you read it and you realize, we're here.
Yeah. I want to hear the term.
Yeah, the term, Peter. We want to hear it.
Just dropped a tease, Peter. What we call in the podcast biz a tease. We got to hear that.
Right. Well, the term I have for this is that Michael J Sullivan is a master of what I call turning the screw. So
Ooh.
this is a story that it starts small, quite insular, because you follow Royce and Hadrian, and then stuff happens, and then the world kind of opens up, and everything falls into place while he's turning, but he's turning it so slowly, and then things happen.
Yes, suddenly it just clicks, right? It's finally in, and that moment, and that is kind of that moment of satisfaction when you are actually turning a screw and you're like, okay, it's in there. And then you kind of back away like, oh yeah, nice. That's such a great term, Peter. I feel like Charles is writing it down right now. Writing it down, Charles?
Well, I'm not right. I am taking a very strong note of it, and I was going to say, this is why you have to follow Peter both on Twitter and on his blog, because these are some hot takes that only a strong blogger familiar with the fantasy genre can drop on you. I was not ready for that. this idea of turning the screw, but it's so true, and it's like Dylan says, like you can feel it, like where it's fitting together, and then it grips, and then it's you see the end, and it comes through, and wow, it's very well said, Peter. I like that phrase. I'm glad we didn't wait. The tease was worth it. Very, very Michael Sullivan of you.
My hastiness had me coming in with the like, okay, yeah, like let's hear it now though. So,
right.
Yes, thanks, Peter.
Cool.
That's going to be in the lexicon, I think, now over there at FBF.
Excellent.
It's spreading, which is exciting, and it's adding to our world building, which leads us into another discussion topic that we wanted
Beautiful
to make
seg.
sure. Thank you. I wanted to make sure we talked about. No fantasy book is complete without an exceptional world built around it, and what has struck Dylan and I when we've talked about the world building for Michael J Sullivan and a lot of more modern fantasy authors is how much do they embrace the high fantasy setting, how much do they embrace the grimdark setting, and how do they bring their voice into a genre that's been so well established since like The Lord of the Rings. And we always thought that the Riyria Revelations was this it succeeded in being very modern feeling, but it had all of the charms and delivered on all the promises of a high fantasy setting as well. And Peter, I wanted to get your sense of the greater world building of the Riyria Revelations and how you would describe, what is this setting? What is this world? What was Michael Sullivan's approach, and how does it stand out in the fantasy genre amongst so many other pillars in the fantasy world?
Okay. So the Riyria Revelations kind of, certainly for me, so it occupies sort of several kind of different sort of sub-genres of fantasy in terms of world building. When you read the books, you'll get this kind of sense, but it starts off in a kind of more like an urban setting. So you have quite sort of like urban fantasy, but then it kind of, you know it's in this world, this world, and turn the books over, or you read in an ebook, and you see the map of Ilan, and you see the specifics. You realise that this is a big world, and then it starts off small, and then it envelopes, and then you get the high fantasy with various aspects that we will not mention because we'll start entering spoiler territory. But then there's that element of grimdark in there, because there are some very well delivered fight scenes, which can become quite violent and quite nasty, and there are some quite nasty bits in places where it's like, oh, it occupies quite a special place in that respect. But in terms of the world building, it's again that turning of the screw where it starts off small and it develops, and it just becomes extraordinary, where you slowly discover what's going on and what the stakes and what needs to be done.
I agree completely. For me, I
Yeah, well
always have
said.
this very well said, and one of the conversations I always have, like internally, it's like, okay, what is grimdark, and what is just the modern style of writing for an author? Like being more honest about the violent aspects of fantasy, and this series, the Riyria Revelations, toes the line really well. And it's like you said, Peter. The story starts so small. It's basically like Royce and Adrian in a room, okay? And then it gets bigger and bigger, and it's like, oh, I have a job for you. And then the job gets bigger and bigger, and you get these like interesting elements of violence and fighting thrown in, and these interesting characterization moments, and you're like, wow, this story, it's it's hard to categorize it in one level. It's just so honestly itself. And I think that's just
Hmm.
like as much praise as I can give for world building a fantasy novel in this day and age. It's like, hey, if your world building is really good and your characters are really good, then you'll draw on elements as you'll need to, and it will just unfold naturally into this world. And to be able to craft these characters and maps and settings in such a way where that can happen is a real success. And I think that's why Michael Sullivan, who these books were, released independently, and I think that's how they like just snowballed into this mass release, and they're now, published works as well. So I think that's just a huge part of its success.
I think one of the attractions of the series is it is that kind of it has those wonderful classic fantasy vibes.
Yes.
And that's where kind of where Michael really draws you in with that classic fantasy setting, the vibes, and then he works his magic.
Yes, in every sense of the word. And I think that it's like, that's such a great point, Peter, because this series sticks out both for that high fantasy setting and then that honestly itself bit that Charles was talking about. I was like, this thing was one of the books. It was my main recommendation when we did, I think, like recommendations for fans of Lord of the Rings. And so much of that is that high fantasy setting, and like just things like dwarves and stuff in the world, and we're not used to that with these elements of like these kind of like silly bantery friends and like very modern feeling dialogue and all that kind of stuff. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think Michael Sullivan wrote this for his daughter and kind of was just like, yeah, as Peter's nodding over there. So I'm going to say that's right. He wrote this for his daughter, and I think it was to like help her with reading. So he was just having fun with it. And you see that. And I think that's where it comes through with all these like honestly itself moments. I love that, Charles. Write that one down. So it's like, yeah. So yeah, these honestly itself moments, and then that balance of that high fantasy saying you're bringing up, Peter, as well as this unbelievable duo. It's just a special place, as I think all of us are kind of saying in this genre.
Certainly. And while we're talking about recommendations, I think we should just roll with that, because one of the things that we also wanted to bring up in this, because it is spoiler free and we're trying to get people to read this series as well as sing its praises, is maybe provide some recommendations or some like similar series that may be a good jumping off point or a jumping towards point. And Dylan, you had mentioned the Lord of the Rings, and
Yes.
I was wondering if you could just go a little bit further into like what exactly about the Lord of the Rings is appealing to fans of Michael J Sullivan or vice versa.
Oh, you're saying like who should? Okay, I feel like should you go back and read the Lord of the Rings if you really liked? I think that I was thinking more from the reverse, like most people have probably read the Lord of the Rings or watched the movies and then come to Michael Sullivan's work. But I do think you could go back, because that's what I did, I guess. Because I'm, I'm like, oh, let me read this stuff. It's like, oh, Lord of the Rings, whatever. Like I do like Lord of the Rings, everyone. But
it's like...
the thing is, yes, the thing is that Yeah, I think that if you're going from the Riyria Revelations to Lord of the Rings, it's for this context piece of like, look, there's no way Riyria. I mean, I don't know Michael Sullivan, but I bet if you asked him, would there be a Riyria Revelations without the Lord of the Rings? He'd probably say no. Like there's the influence feels too odd, right? Tolkien brought these high fantasy things into the fantasy genre. He brought a lot into the fantasy genre that we're still having fun with. And I think that's what Michael Sullivan's doing is he's having fun with these things, just writing a thing for his daughter, having fun. And then he's looking back at the Lord of the Rings. So I think I guess that was kind of what I did. So I, read the stuff that Michael Sullivan was having fun with and go back and be like, oh, okay, he probably read this and was like, well, let's see what happens when I give it the Michael Sullivan spin. Yeah. I have one more series I like that I would recommend.
Well, first up, Peter, do you have any reaction to the Lord of the Rings, Michael Sullivan, Riyria Revelations connection?
I would probably recommend it to anyone who has read The Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
And I sort of completely agree with you, Dylan, about the sort of the comparisons and not the comparisons as such, the things you will find that you enjoyed about The Lord of the Rings, you might find within Michael J Sullivan. I think it's an important point maybe to say that you might enjoy this.
Yeah. That's fair.
If you did that, because if I know fantasy readers, then they're people's tastes, opinions, and thoughts are always going to be different. And
your mileage may vary.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Exactly.
So Dylan, you had another recommendation for us. You want to get out there?
Well, we just read The Shadow of the Gods by the incredible John Gwynne, and we recorded an episode on that with the incredible Sam Book in Hand.
That we did.
And that was so much fun. And I was thinking this kind of like special place in the fantasy genre that draws from some of these old school world building elements, high fantasy elements, and things like that. And while bringing in that more like some of these grimdark elements, some of this intense violence, and that just sitting in that balance in a place that's geez, Charles, what did you say? Like something itself. But it's like
honestly itself.
Honestly,
I wrote it down,
it's
so
like,
I remember.
Yes, I know. See, that's that's why this works. So I feel like both, it's a totally different setting, a totally different world. We've got that like Nordic setting from John Gwynne's work, so don't expect it to be this high fantasy medieval setting, but just this like wonderfully itself merger of the older mysticism and like high fantasy stuff with the more modern feel that we've been talking about. I think both John Gwynne's work, at least we've only read The Shadow of the Gods so far, but from what I've read of it and what I've heard from all sorts of folks on Twitter and stuff, as well as the wonderful work of Michael Sullivan's like merger of those two elements. So I'm like, those two are the connection that I see.
Interesting. And I know, Peter, that The Faithful and the Fallen is a series that you've listed on your blog as one of your favorite fantasy series. So I'm wondering what your reaction, like if you have any comparison points between John Gwynne's work and Michael Sullivan's work here in the Riyria Revelations.
Well, firstly, I'm really shocked that neither of you have read the Faithful and the Fallen.
I know.
I think a lot of people that listen to us are.
I'm just like, we'll
get there.
It's been recommended countless times, and you are one of those strong voices.
I can see it on the shelf. Eyeing
it longingly, like.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Let's just get back to the question.
He's trying to resist the urge to throw The Faithful and the Fallen series through a Zoom call
across the pond here into the US.
That would be an almighty throw if it did happen.
with how much I feel like you want to, you might be able to make it.
Oh well, I can't get to it easily at the moment. So, but the sort of comparison between Michael and John is an interesting one. Certainly with the high fantasy world, which is, again, as I've alluded to on my blog, is that genius of secondary creation, where an author, and this is for the benefit of people listening to the podcast who might not understand what that term means, the term is used to where an author takes a setting and blends it with a fantasy setting, so that you get that otherworldly but potentially familiar sensation or feel when you read the book. And The Faithful and the Fallen is an amazing example of that. It's definitely that high fantasy comparison with the Riyria Revelations, I would see. And also that if you're looking for a recommendation, you would come for the amazing characters, the world building, and also a very good story.
Yeah.
That's well said, Dylan. Right. I hope you were taking notes through that.
that doesn't happen very often, me taking notes. But I was thinking, genius of secondary creation. Was that the line you dropped, Peter? I'm like,
yeah.
You, Charles, since you have your notebook over, I see him writing it down. So that is so true, Peter, and I think that's brilliant. I think you're adding a lot of these phrases that might be coming up.
I know, we're getting educated here. This is fantastic. I'd say I have one last comparison between Michael and John. Okay, having only read Shadow of the Gods, as we all now know, we've been outed. But I will say that what I really liked about Shadow of the Gods, that I also really like about Riyria Revelations, is I feel like a lot of times with modern authors, there's a lot of pressure to jump into the grimdark aspects, or maybe jump into the morally gray aspects of a character, or like rogue characters, whatever, of which all these books have. But what it also does is it embraces some of these classic fantasy elements and recognizes, like, hey, there's some of these mythologies and creatures and characters that are just a lot of fun that can still exist in a modern world where we're telling the violence in a very honest way, and we're getting deep into the characterization of these characters, and they're not all totally virtuistic, but there's still very fun things about classic fantasy that I don't want to lose when I'm writing this story. And both of these authors nail that so well. So you have all of these fun world building elements, all of these cool creatures and things, or duos and relationships and kings and all that. But then you also have this very modern portrayal of, like we discussed, the violence can be quite shocking, and the philosophical debates are very modern in both of these works. So, and the characters and the characterizations are also very modern, but it's these fun elements of what makes fantasy entertaining and what has made fantasy fun since Lord of the Rings that shine brightly in both of these series. So that to me is a comparison that I see between them.
Cool. Can I throw one last recommendation?
Throw in as much as you'd like, Peter. We're here.
Because I've been thinking about it, and then it's got that if you want a nice comparison or a series you recommend to someone of the Riyria Revelation, this again comes off the bat of a good story and a well-developed world. Always, and don't give me too much stick for this, going to say The Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss.
Oh. Give you shtick. Come on.
Do you know what show you're on?
Yes, we love The Kingkiller Chronicle.
I know.
Yes.
No, I know.
Damian, you said the magic words. I'll give you a little. I mentioned.
Oh, it's the comparison video. Sorry, my son.
So for our listeners, I do this sometimes when we have guests on, is I'll throw like background videos on the Zoom call. I wish you wonderful listeners could see this picture of me. It's me when I grew out my beard really long, trying to be like Patrick Rothfuss. I'm wearing like a same navy blue shirt as him. It's like a famous Rothfuss picture. And I will have to say that Patrick Rothfuss, author of the wonderful Kingkiller Chronicle, does rock a beard much better than me. As do two people I'm in this Zoom call with, also two wonderful beards. You both are rocking it.
Too kind.
You really are.
But I mean, we love the Kingkiller Chronicles, but Peter, I'm curious to hear you connect it to the Riyria Revelations, because for me, I didn't make the connection, but I'm very interested, and I think I know where you're going, but I'd love to hear where this recommendation is coming from.
You would look at it the same with there are some wonderful characters in the Kingdom. It is a very well developed world. And you would, if you read it, you would enjoy the writing as much as you might enjoy the writing within the Riyria Revelations. I think they both have what I like to describe as a very nice, easy, accessible writing style, which it helps ease the reader in to something they're maybe not familiar with.
That's well said. I would, because to me their voices as authors are so different, but what they have in common is they both have this charm about them, and it's that charm that is so inviting and is so unpretentious and so direct in a way that is approachable to a lot of readers, and that's a really interesting connection. I agree completely.
It's so interesting because I guess I don't usually think of Patrick Rothfuss's writing as necessarily like accessible, because I get caught up on this like idea of it as like the beautiful prose, but that is what makes it accessible, is like you forget you're reading like you just lose yourself in it, right? You just kind of are like, oh wow, this is just kind of like being told a story, and I do see that connection to the accessibility of Michael Sullivan's writing too. So you kind of you blew my mind a little bit there, Peter. I'm gonna be honest, because I'm like, what? Wait! I can call Rothfuss's writing accessible and feel like I'm being correct? I was like, yes, I can. So,
yeah, because you can have a high fantasy world that you feel like, oh, that's a detail I gotta do I have to remember that detail? Is that going to be a clue for later? Is this a character that's going to come back or not? But when you're reading Rothfuss and he's going like, oh, but you're like, oh yeah, this is so good, and you always just get a sense of the scene. And Michael Sullivan as well, you're just enjoying the moments of being in there, and you're not too concerned about, is this a clue? Is this a character that's, going to come back? Is this a world-building element? It is, and it always pays off. And again, that's that reading experience I love to talk about. It's like, it will, and you just can read it and appreciate it on face value. And it's you don't have to get lost in the details of either of these stories. Like, the details present themselves in ways that we can enjoy them through the narrative and not have to like be reading that much deeper to figure it out, which you can if you'd like to. And there's tons of like content creators focused on theorizing for Kingkiller Chronicles, and there's plenty you could in the first book of Riyria Revelations try and predict for the next two. There's no end to that, but it's certainly not a requirement for the reading experience and to enjoy the story. And that's such an interesting comparison, Peter. I'm like talking myself more and more into it as I'm going.
I know.
Every time Dylan speaks, they've got this wonderful picture that comes up of Rothfuss there and then Dylan there. I've got to say it's 10 out of 10 for effort, Dylan.
Oh, there you go.
Effort, right? I know, that's exactly
10 out of 10
it.
for effort. Yeah, no,
yes,
10 out of 10 for
effort. Like, you can still see the part. Like, I was talking before we started recording, I was talking to Peter and Charles about this. It's like, you can see that my mustache doesn't actually connect to my beard despite months and months of trying. And Rothfuss is killing it though. So
it's funny. It's like Dylan's expounding all this wisdom, and yet when he pops up, we see this, hilarious but amazing photo in the background. So It's trying to. You're gonna have to post it, Dylan, so people will know what we're talking about, and that's something you can take a note on. So I guess I'll give a recommendation, and this one might be coming out of left field here a little bit, but it wouldn't be an episode of Friends Talking Fantasy if we didn't talk about the King Killer Chronicles and also the work of Joe Abercrombie. And I'm bringing up Joe Abercrombie only because of the charm and the humor. They're very different kinds of books, but I will say the characters in both, Abercrombie's work and in the Riyria Revelations, just listening to them talk to each other and listening to the narration is funny. They're not telling jokes to each other, but the moments they're in and the things they say make you feel like you're along for the ride with them and you're laughing and you're like, oh, that's clever, or oh, I get why that's a joke. Like, I recognize that Abercrombie's telling a joke through the way he's writing this character's narration. Same thing with Riyria Revelations. It's like you said, it opens and one's just apologizing to the other one. It's like, that's inherently funny, and it only goes further from there as you get to know them and you get to catch on to some of these isms that they go through as part of their relationship. And very few authors' voices in the genre present humor in that way, and I think that's just why the connection between the two of them is so strong for me. I mean, Abercrombie's telling different kinds of stories than that's in the Riyria Revelations, but just the humor between characters and dialogue is very strong between the two of them. So that's why I am making that connection and making those recommendations.
That's a very very interesting comparison, actually, Charles. Again, not having read much of Abercrombie, confession.
Oh boy, it's the tables have turned now. I'm going to try and throw all of the first law through the Zoom call, through the pond here. I think Dylan has left his chair. He's going to his bookshelf. There he is. He's back.
Right.
He's got an armful of books. But you were saying, Peter, we had to do that. Had to do that.
I know, it's all right. But the Joe Abercrombie has this wonderful way he tells his stories, which again is akin to Michael Sullivan, where they're particularly with the first trilogy,
the first law, the Blade
law
itself,
the first law trilogy, which again is an interconnected series of books, but you don't realize this, particularly when you're reading the first book, because it's kind of quite intimate to begin with, and then oh my goodness me, does it open up into a well. Frankly, it's not very nice, but we don't call Joe Abercrombie Lord Grimdark for no reason.
I was gonna say, Peter, you need to give your disclaimer again of look, everyone has different tastes, but just because you liked Riyria Revelations or you liked Abercrombie does not mean you like them both necessarily.
I think it's like that Abercrombie, especially that first trilogy, is very grimdark, as we know, and grimdark comes with a level of cynicism. Mm-hmm. And I think that Michael Sullivan brings a level of optimism and hopefulness to but it's kind of this, you do have all these disparate things. You're like, what is all this building toward? And then in Sullivan, he's more optimistic and hopeful. But let's be real here. Just about every fantasy author, I feel like, is more optimistic and hopeful than some of. Well, I don't know. I guess maybe we did. There's some that get rated more grimdark on that. We mentioned that Mark Lawrence poll in our Where to Start with Grimdark episode, and some books get rated more grimdark than the first law, so I guess that's fair, but not a lot of books get rated more grimdark than the first law. So you do expect, yes, both of them will tie all the threads together, but it's Joe Abercrombie is going to be more cynical about how he does it. So yeah, it's just interesting. That's why I love getting all these different perspectives, because it's like I would never have thought to say Joe. I mean, and I'm pretty quick to say Joe Abercrombie, and I'm pretty quick to say Kingkiller Chronicle, but I never would have thought to say those, and both of you did. So that's awesome.
Hey,
Yeah, so I feel like we're working our way towards the end of this conversation here. But before we do, I just wanted to turn it back to you guys. And I guess, Peter, do you have any closing thoughts about the Riyria Revelations? Anything else you want to bring up? Or maybe make sure someone who hasn't read the Riyria Revelations yet should be aware of before we wrap it up today?
someone who hasn't read the Riyria Revelations before.
Right.
Okay. Just be prepared to enter a classic fantasy world, and Michael will pull you in, and you will discover the worlds of Michael J Sullivan. That's all I'm gonna say. It really is.
Yeah, you know, I can see you being like, how do I say this without spoiling all these amazing things? So I appreciate that, Peter, and well said.
Yes. Well said, and thank you for bringing that home for us, because it's true. We don't want to get into spoiler territory, but we got to say, look, you're going to enter this awesome fantasy world and just be prepared for the Sullivan reading experience here. But we're telling you guys, we all read it, we all loved it, we all thought it paid off, and we all recommend it highly. So,
oh yes.
Yep. The Riyria Revelations by Michael J Sullivan, recommended by the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast and friend of the show, Peter the Swordsmith. Peter, thank you so much for coming on and educating us on all these fascinating terms, and for contextualizing Riyria Revelations for all the listeners out there. We thank you for your time and your expertise as a fantasy blogger. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, it's been a genuine honor to be with you both, and to talk fantasy with you both. I think I'll go down and say that I love listening to your podcast. And you know, congratulations on the doing it for 1 year so far.
Yes.
And long may it continue. And it has, I know I'm probably going to repeat myself, but it's been an honor just to be on here and just talk fantasy with you both.
Peter,
it's an absolute honor to have you on and to talk fantasy with you, our friend. So that's what this has always been about. And we just love doing it. You added all of these new phrases that Charles has written down wherever he keeps all this stuff. And it's like, we're going to be coming back to all of that. I just am so happy that you came on and got to chat with us. This is really awesome.
It is awesome. Again, with the Friends Talking Fantasy.
That's what it's all about.
It's just brilliant.
Well, thank you so much. It's always an awesome opportunity when we can go from the Twitter sphere to talking on the show, and we've had so much fun just communicating with you and other fantasy bloggers as well. And guys, you gotta check out Peter the Swordsmith both on Twitter and on his blog at The Swordsmith. So we are gonna link both of those in the description. You definitely want to check those out. And guys, we've done it. I hope we've done justice to the Riyria Revelations. I think we have. If you've made it to the end of this episode, and you're not convinced to read it, well, I don't know what else we can do. Thank you all so much for listening. Peter, thank you again for your time. This has been such a pleasure. And as always, guys, go forth and conquer, friends.